Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. Dr. Michael B. Boston from SUNY Brockport is one of the leading revisionist scholars of Booker T. Washington, focusing on Washington's efforts to increase African American entrepreneurship in the early 20th century. I spoke with Dr. Boston about his interventions and in particular about his brand new article for the New York History Journal on Washington's influence on Black entrepreneurship in New York City.
Washington, in his annual addresses at the National Negro Business League, even his local ones going to New York City, he would tell them what you have and what you should have. And one of the things he promoted to New Yorkers in 1900 that there should be a bank here. We have banks in the South, but you have a large African American population here. You don't have a bank. So yes, Washington was this catalyst, I think, that really pulled people together to encourage them to be more proactive business-wise, not just for themselves, but for their communities as well.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Michael B. Boston. Dr. Boston is Associate Professor in the Department of African and African American Studies at the State University of New York, Brockport. He is the author of an important major revisionist study of Booker T. Washington entitled The Business Strategy of Booker T. Washington, which was published by University Press of Florida. He's also co-author of a book on Dr. P.H. Skinner's School for Blind and Deaf African American Students in Western New York. And additionally, Dr. Boston's next monograph, Blacks in Niagara Falls, 1849 to 1985, will be published later in 2021 by SUNY Press. Now, his latest work, his latest article, which is the focus of our conversation today, is on Booker T. Washington and the New York City Business League. And this is appearing in issue 102.1 of the New York History Journal, which of course I enthusiastically encourage everyone watching to subscribe to and read as often as you can. And so I am excited to have Dr. Boston here to talk about that and his broader works. So welcome, Michael.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's really a privilege to have you here because I really appreciate your revisionist take on Booker T. Washington in general, including in the article, but also in your broader work. And you really present what I think could be described as a radical challenge to the conventional wisdom. And I think it's a compelling and nuanced challenge to the sort of consensus view of Booker T. Washington. And at the heart of your argument is his entrepreneurial philosophy. And I think this is a very important intervention. So I think as a starting point, if you don't mind, could you spell out for us a bit what Washington's entrepreneurial philosophy and business program were, sort of what he was looking at as how he was going to make this work?
Okay, I think most people that study Booker T. Washington are exposed to his industrial education program. And I think most historians and a lot of laypersons, when they focused on him, they looked at that in terms of an educational sense and not really focusing on it from an entrepreneurial perspective. And right after construction, when Washington, rose to leadership after that 1895 Atlanta Exposition address, I would say by 1891, he had his business philosophy intact in terms of what he wanted to do. And he really saw that as an upliftment strategy. He wanted African Americans to be laborers, but also to be entrepreneurs, because he saw entrepreneurs as being the real shakers and makers of policies within American society. So at the highest state of his upliftment program was this business philosophy of creating these entrepreneurs. So if you look at his philosophy, it's similar to a lot of business persons' philosophies. If you look at some of the prominent American elites that promoted, economic development, he learned, or he took some things from some of those individuals. So in terms of his philosophy, he was basically telling his people to get practical education that could be applied to doing some type of entrepreneur activity. Um, and if you look at a lot of his speeches, they really spell out philosophy. Not a single speech, but different speeches really spell it out. So he's number one. He's telling his people to get um, practical education that can be applied, because he saw his people coming out of the slavery era as needing to get skills, as a lot of us know when we study Booker T. Washington, but get these skills so you can make yourself an economic force. And that, of course, that would be being an entrepreneur. So if you look at his speeches, once again, he has such as earn a skill, be able to market that skill, and not just to the African American market, to the entire market of anybody that wanted a good or service. Um, you know, get an economic niche, do a particular activity so well that you'll be in demand. Pay the price of business success. Like any entrepreneur, you have to work hard. You have to stay abreast of your trade or whatever profession that you're in. And this was also part of his strategy to help end the race problem too, because he envisioned that if African Americans made themselves, a force within communities that was of value, reflecting merit, then that community of races would embrace those entrepreneurs and those people and not want to hate them and kick them out of the community. Now, where does this type of philosophy originate? It originated from his experience running Tuskegee Institute, because he saw Tuskegee as being this asset to the community that was valued. I mean, at first, he talks about an Up from Slavery, his second autobiography, about how people were leery. A lot of whites in the community were leery that this was going to just create liberal arts persons that were going to try to live by their wits, what have you. But he was saying, if we make ourselves indispensable assets, offer merit to the community, this will be a way of, helping to end the race problem. So he had other components that were part of his business philosophy. And, in starting the National Negro Business League, he wanted to spread this philosophy. Now, I myself, when I look at history, I don't see anybody or any African American being a promoter of this business development to the extent that Washington was. And I myself call him the father of 20th century African American business development. So there are other components. I mean, people like one of your former colleagues, Lewis Harlem. When he talked about Booker T. Washington, he did not say that he was an entrepreneur. Lewis Harlem wrote an early article. It was published, as I remember, 1969. When he looked at Washington, he didn't really look at him from a business sense. He just said he wasn't a businessman, even though he created the National Negro Business League. And Harlem is one of these people that, he pretty much was saying his philosophy was narrow, like W.E.B. Du Bois, because he was advocating business, within just the African American community. And I myself, I dispute that based on, the records that I have seen and seeing what Booker T. Washington's overall philosophy for his people was. So business development was an integral part of his philosophy. And that's where I come in, and I like to push people towards looking at that. Because when I first really got into the studies of Washington, I got a lot of negative feedback. Oh, that's a road well traveled, that's been covered. And then, I heard people really dismissing him, belittling him. And I looked into it and I focused on that aspect because I have an economic background. So I looked at that and I saw that, and I wanted to really push that out for people to look at and see. And as they read his primary sources, speeches, or what have you, focus on that too. So.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about that because I noticed that you not only have your doctorate in history, but you also have, I think, an MBA, right? So you have multiple angles that you can approach this from. And you noted in the book that there are a lot of 20th century African American business people who very openly invoke Booker T. Washington. And so that's an interesting starting point to then go back to the history. How did your business background influence your ability to understand what was going on in this business history?
When I read Up From Slavery, I could see, clearly some of the business concepts. And when he talked about merit and how you making yourself an indispensable asset in your community and things such as that. And then when I broadly looked at other communities and I looked at entrepreneurs from all the way up to 1955, where there were cities that, even small towns, I should say, but mainly cities that had African American entrepreneurs, I found that a lot of those individuals paid homage to Booker T. Washington. I mean, I found them all over America, mainly in the South, but they really paid homage to his economic philosophy, the business people I'm talking about, such as George Gaston in Birmingham, Alabama. He met Washington, and the fact that he wanted to attend Tuskegee, but he was not financially able to attend Tuskegee. But he did read Up From Slavery, and he talked about how much of a value it was for him. And he embraced this concept of offering goods and services within his community, becoming an indispensable economic force or asset within his community. And Black Enterprise magazine in the 90s, I don't remember the specific year, but they noted George Gaston as being the most prominent African-American entrepreneur in the 20th century because, when he passed away, his, business was worth millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And a lot of people would have thought it was John Johnson of Ebony, but it was this George Gaston. But the business background, it allowed me to focus, more on pulling out those economic dimensions. And Washington really focused on that. He was very much influenced by Lewis Adams, who was a local entrepreneur in Tuskegee. And, he was one of these persons that Washington mentions in his speeches and in Up From Slavery as experienced slavery, never went into the classroom, had the opportunity to go into a classroom, but he was a jack of all trades type of person. And he had a hardware store in Tuskegee, Alabama, that catered to the whole community of Macon County. And he talked about how this individual offered goods to the community and how much of a value he was. And he really, he respected him very highly for the skills that he had. And this was part of the things he was trying to pass on. So yes, the business, I think, really helped me more to hone in on the economic dimensions, whereas before I did not see a lot of earlier historians do that.
It's clear to me that you really caught on to something, because you make very clear that it wasn't just a philosophy. It was a philosophy that was put into action, which, I mean, Washington is, as you point out again and again, he's about operating within a real life context and trying to make people's lives better, both in the moment and in the long run, in, dealing with real conditions. And so you argue, you demonstrate, I think, that Washington, these are your words, he aggressively promoted his entrepreneurial ideas. What were some of the ways that he promoted this business philosophy you're talking about?
Well, I think he promoted it with the students, in his when he was on campus, because he was away probably at least 1/3 of the year trying to raise funds. But when he was on campus, his Sunday chats to the students, he would echo this philosophy, telling them to make themselves indispensable assets. If you're going to be farmers, take it to the highest degree, become an entrepreneur as a farmer, where you're selling goods and sell these goods in the market. That was one way. Also on campus, he had various businesses in which he incorporated the students into those businesses. And those goods like printing, mattress making, wagon making, those were sold to the communities in which the students engaged in that, and they got lessons in that. Well, let me say this as well. I mean, in terms of the way he operated Tuskegee, he was, like a business executive. He operated Tuskegee as though it was a corporation. He had lower level people. He gave them responsibilities, and he expected them to, adhere to them. There were chains of command, so on and so forth. Washington wanted to know how much milk was produced for the day, what students got expelled, how much revenue was sent in. And then conferences, it started off nationally in Boston in 1900, and it continued to 1915 when he passed away. And the records for these conventions or conferences, they have been recorded. And, I've gone through most of them, and in them you can see how various entrepreneurs, they describe how they promote to others, how they could be successful business-wise. And these types of ideas Washington wanted to have in specific communities to encourage other people. He wanted these delegates to go out and encourage other people. And at the end of each one of these conventions, he would give an annual message. And in those messages, he would highlight various concepts in terms of entrepreneurship. And as time went on, he even had people that we could call experts give talks about, how to keep better records, how to advertise better, and so on and so forth. Now, that was nationally. Also, as a leader, he went about the country in various communities and gave local addresses. I found local addresses in which he talked to people about business development. So he did it on various levels.
Well, I'd like to pick up on the creation of the National Negro Business League in 1900 that you just invoked a moment ago. There are some, you've pointed out, including Du Bois himself, that think that this as sort of the brainchild of Du Bois and his coming out of Atlanta in 1899. And you pretty definitively demonstrate that this is coming from Washington and some of his associates. What is the relationship between that sort of emerging, because it hasn't burst yet, but that emerging controversy between these two men and their two sort of schools of thought, and the creation of the National Negro Business League? And does it fit into that narrative? Does it challenge that narrative at all?
Well, that's an excellent question. And in my chapter on the National Business League, I addressed that. W.E.B. Du Bois was head of the business division of the Afro-American League. The Afro-American League was the first national civil rights organization in this country. And people that in history that were opposed to each other, they were actually in that organization. The way historians have written about how they were opposed to each other. Ida B. Wells was in it, Du Bois was in it, Washington was in it, T. Thomas Fortune was in it. And Du Bois was, he was head of the business department of that organization. And as you and many others are aware, at Atlanta University, Du Bois, he had these annual conferences when he was there, and one of his first encyclopedia publications was the Negro, in which he gave out surveys across the country to take that data and write, like a 500-600 page encyclopedia book on the Negro in business. In 1900, Washington started the organization, and Du Bois has even written, I found an article in which he wrote, he came up with that idea as though, he kind of hints that he was sort of like the father of this Negro Business League idea. Now, it's a controversial, it's a debate in terms of who actually came up with the idea. But Washington, believe it or not, he even at this in 1900, Du Bois and Washington had a friendly relationship. I mean, Du Bois had even come and participated in the Negro Farmers Conference. And, as some people are aware, Washington offered Du Bois a job at least twice. And he wrote a letter of recommendation for him to be superintendent of Negro education in Washington, D.C. Du Bois didn't get that job. So Washington asked him for, a list of Negro, what they called then Negro businessmen in the country, to send a flyer to the people to participate in the first National Negro Business League meeting in 1900. So they had a friendship, but Washington took that idea further and actually institutionalized that idea. And he considered himself the founder. But once again, we people that were not there involved in the process, I think a lot of us more so debate who's the real father, whether it's Du Bois or whether it's Washington. I mean, Washington himself took credit for finding it. And as I just mentioned earlier, Du Bois took credit for finding and promoting that idea, in which Booker T. Washington embraced and took off and created this institution. It didn't become a problem, at least Du Bois didn't really highlight that until they actually had this confrontation when Du Bois wrote in his book, The Soul of Black Folks, of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. That's when it actually came out after that. So it's a debate. I look at it as though that Du Bois did this early work, but Washington actually, institutionalized it. And as a matter of fact, after Washington institutionalized that idea, as I remember reading this, Du Bois still remained, at least in the Afro-American League, until it ultimately, no longer existed. It only lasted for maybe 4 years or something like that. But like I said, they had a friendly relationship until that article of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. And just, it's a debate. Which side do people want to go on? The people that tend to support Du Bois, realizing that he was the founder, and ones that support Washington would say that he's the founder. So perhaps we'll never find out who the original founder is, but we know Washington institutionalized it. Yeah.
Well, even the ambiguity, I think, is an important intervention, because so many people from when Du Bois writes of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, and from that point forward, people just sort of assume there's always this rift, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And I appreciate you bringing that back up, because I think later on, when we circle back to sort of the legacies of this, I think it's important for us to remember that it wasn't always this sort of weird dichotomy that 21st century historians sort of assume. And it wasn't just 21st century historians, it's been 100 years worth of historians, as you point out in your book. Well, in your book, which, as I said, I'd like to return to a bit later on, you suggest that having made this argument about Washington's business strategy, you said that now your book lays a foundation, and others are going to have to look at case studies. And fortunately for us, you present one of those case studies. You took up the call, and you look at New York City in this article that's coming out for New York History Journal. And so first, one of the things that I found exciting about the article is that you pointed out, and you mentioned it a moment ago, Booker T. Washington spent a lot of time away from Tuskegee raising funds, and you point out in the article that he spent a lot of that time in New York City. And so I'm wondering what kind of experiences Washington had in New York City in general. Who were some of his connections? What were some of his experiences that might have been influential for him? Overall, is there any influence or impact of the New York experiences on Booker T. Washington?
Well, I think he realized that was the #1 cosmopolitan city in the United States, and it was a place that he was going to have to go to raise funds. And Up From Slavery, he has that chapter in there about raising money. I think he developed a strategy in terms of raising money that probably filtered down to his business philosophy. In terms of raising money, he was going to go through a procedure. He was going to introduce his school and talk about his school. He wasn't going to beg these New York City entrepreneurs or New England entrepreneurs for money. He was just going to highlight his school and positive things that his school was doing and what his school was doing to elevate his racial group. I think some of these entrepreneurs realized that they had made, or their families had made tremendous profits on the slavery period with cotton and so on and so forth. And they were like Andrew Carnegie in the sense that they felt that they were sort of like a higher human being, that, okay, you have all of this wealth, but you want to, do good. It's almost like God gave you all this wealth. Now you have to not just have it, but you have to make society better. So, he would go through his procedure in introducing his school. And then later he talked about maybe 5 years later, he would get a large contribution to those people. And, so I think it helped highlight a system that he developed, dealing with Viola Ruffner when he was a child. She taught him to develop a system when you do something and do it consistently. These entrepreneurs in New York City that he interacted with, William Baldwin, for example, who became he was on the board of directors for Tuskegee Institute. He helped Washington with his finance, the school's finances. He helped the school get his finances on a higher level. And Washington, and Up from Slavery, even makes the point that he wanted his school to be on the same level as a top level business. It really helped to bring that out. So that's something that he got from him. And the other entrepreneurs as well. I'm just trying to remember some of them off the top of my head. But in terms of the African American entrepreneurs, I think he admired some of their creations, like T. Thomas Fortune, for example. He created a newspaper that was the top newspaper in the country, the New York Age. So he respected him for that. And there were smaller entrepreneurs, and he always had a saying, and I think Samuel Chapman Armstrong instilled that into him, that all labor is honorable as long as it's honest. So I think him just operating in their setting, particularly in New York City, I think it really reinforced some of the principles that from the African American entrepreneurs, reinforced some of his basic principles. But people like William Baldwin really helped to, I think, develop his entrepreneur philosophy, even better. And I think by him seeing New York City, even to what Tuskegee Institute could be, what other African American entrepreneurs could achieve if they were persistent and they worked out a system and did develop economic niches and stayed abreast of their fields. They could go as far as possible. I just think it helped to reinforce a lot of his principles, but William Baldwin really helped him economically, because William Baldwin is the one who actually sent an auditor to Tuskegee to help get his records up to par, and Washington really learned a lot from that auditor auditing the records of Tuskegee Institute. So.
That's great. It's interesting because we, I think, often associate the African Americans who were most enthusiastic about Washington with the South, and of course, most African American population was still in the South at this time. And you point out that the Negro Business League had a lot more local chapters in the South, but New York City's branch became a very important one. And there were some very important African-American businessmen who were part of this and who were close associates of Washington. You mentioned T. Thomas Fortune a moment ago. There were also people who were helping to form this New York branch. Wilfred Smith and James E. Garner seem to be important in your story. And you had pointed out in the article that even a few years earlier, there had been the Afro-American Investment and Building Company, right? And so there were people in New York who were starting to do the kind of thing Washington was calling for. So it seems like a natural fit, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spelling it out. I mean, there was a group of people there, and New York City is expanding even more and more in population, particularly the African-American population, because of the migration movements after 1890. They're coming from the South and they're coming from the Caribbean. And so, as you hinted, there's a group of people that are there, and, small group, and they're entrepreneurs. But I think when Washington came in there, he kind of galvanized these individuals, right? Brought them together to form this organization where they would get inspiration and encourage other people to, create businesses. I mean, Frederick Moore, for example, was this economic nationalist that was, he was out before Washington. But when Washington came along, it just really pushed him to really go out even more and give speeches even more in terms of promoting African-American businesses. And he even became the national organizer for the National Negro Business League. So he went about New York City and he traveled organizing local branches of the National Negro Business League, or trying to bring them together if they had diffused. You had Philip A. Patton. Some people are familiar with him, and he talked about that he was at a National Negro Business League meeting. I believe, as I remember, it was Louisville. He was at one of those national conventions, and he got he was inspired, and it helped him to form his realty company. And as you and others know, that he's designated as the father of Harlem, because he got some white apartment building owners to allow him to rent those buildings out, and he, of course, rented them out to African Americans. And you had white flight, and this is how Harlem, there were entrepreneurs there, but Washington's agency served as a unit to pull them together, to work together, to promote the expansion of other businesses. Because as I mentioned in that article, Washington, he had researchers at Tuskegee that would research communities, and they would tell him what the communities had. And Monroe Works, for example, is one of these researchers that would let Washington know what communities had. And Washington, in his annual addresses at the National Negro Business League, even his local ones going to New York City, he would tell them what you have and what you should have. And one of the things he promoted to New Yorkers in 1900, that there should be a bank here. We have banks in the South, but you have a large African-American population here, you don't have a bank. So yes, Washington was this catalyst, I think, that really pulled people together to encourage them to be more proactive business-wise, not just for themselves, but for their communities as well. Because keep in mind, he was for racial upliftment. So it wasn't just for the individual, it was for the group. Help yourself, and then also help others. Be a captain of industry. You be a role model in your community by people seeing you, and that will encourage others if they were hesitant about doing it. Because remember, his strategy is, if you make yourself an indispensable asset to your community, and not just your community, others, if you grow to become an economic force to reckon with, that's going to help in the race problem.
Well, I think it's a really fascinating. There's 2 points you brought up there that I'd love to explore. One is, I think you do such a nice job of showing how the Booker T. Washington, as this national leader, and various entrepreneurs around the country, including in New York, they sort of grow from each other. You point out in the book especially that after Washington became so sought after as a speaker after 1895, he's traveling around the country, and you say, he witnesses what African-American entrepreneurs are doing and achieving in places all around the country. And that helps him, I think you say, sort of develop this vision that he already had, but seeing it in a more broad national scope of entrepreneurship for racial uplift. And then he provides a national framework for people who had been doing that sort of thing in New York and elsewhere to come together and have that sort of national leadership and national sort of movement. And so I think you present it as a very sort of elegant collaboration that comes together in these years. And it's really fascinating to see how those levels worked together. And I hope I'm sort of understanding it correctly, because to me it's fascinating how it's sort of he and the grassroots sort of working, not collaboratively. I mean, he's the leader, but sort of learning from one another. Is that a proper characterization?
Yes, I think so. Yes, yes, yes,
And
definitely.
I, I also loved in the article when you say, he shows up with the statistics in 1909, 1910. He's looking at the census numbers and he's saying, based on your population in New York City, you ought to have this many businesses and you ought to have this much. And I think he basically implies that it's New York at the moment was a missed opportunity for African-American business. How did New Yorkers, African-American New Yorkers, respond to this? Because you demonstrate in your article that professionalism grew in the years after that. Were people alarmed? Did they try to make more of what Booker T. Washington said was a great opportunity in New York?
I would say, I think the majority of people, the masses, and some of the middle class, a lot of the middle class, I think they respected Washington's words. I mean, everywhere you always had people that were pro anti-Washington. So I think some of the people that were, anti-Washington, as time goes on, they might slight some of his statements and ignore it, and not really want to pay much attention to it. But I think a lot of these people, they respected it, and a lot of them strove to do better. I think this is how they generally took it. I see the masses in general really respecting Washington. And I think some of the intellectual class may have had a problem with some of his ideas, but I think people in the African American population in general, they respected him. If they didn't necessarily agree with something, they didn't come out right and say, from what I've seen, this is nonsense or what have you. So he was able to capture the mass. I would say the same Marcus Garvey was able to generally capture the masses, as opposed to a small group of intellectuals. It reminds me of an article that I think was published in the World's Work, in which Washington talked about the intellectuals. He said they know books, but they don't know life. That was one of his critiques. But to answer your question, I would say in general that they respected it, and some of the comments that were written in the books that were published on the National Negro Business League from people that were there was like, they were amazed that Washington knew so much about their communities when he started spewing those statistics. They were really, they would say that, oh, wow, how does he know so much about us? People like Monroe Works, who was a tremendous researcher, wrote many articles himself and some encyclopedia, he and others with this information. But to answer your question, I would say in general, they were really supportive of what he had to say, and they were pleased that he was in their communities speaking, that he had visited their communities to speak. Sort of like a great leader visiting your community, and people, the masses, respecting that.
Yeah, well, it comes through in your article that in New York there were a lot of people who were really responsive to this movement, and you talked a bit about Afro-American Realty, which I mean, it has a revolutionary influence on New York, but there were others. There was, earlier than that, the Metropolitan, Mercantile, and Realty company. And they had, it sounds like they had a few very good years. I mean, they had land they were buying in New York and New Jersey. They were promoting home ownership. I know it only lasted about a decade or so, but it seems to have had some legacies as far as training people for business and also promoting entrepreneurship and home ownership, right?
Yes, yes, it did. They were conscious of segregation within society, racism, and they talked about some of their members go to specific schools Some might have gone to schools that accepted some African Americans, and these African Americans could have high grades, but when they got out and searched for a job, because of racism, they would ultimately not be hired in these, companies, corporations. And they highlighted that, they needed to form businesses so they could provide the opportunities, owning land and these students getting training within corporations. They would argue that you could get the book training in school, but if you didn't have anywhere to go to practice that, you couldn't really develop that. So they were promoting their people to create these businesses to incorporate some members of their racial group, so that they could also have the opportunity. And they wanted people to patronize their businesses. Some of them would highlight the race situation, that we may have, our products may cost a little more money, but in the end we're trying to uplift our racial group, and you just have to be patient. So those were some of those things that some of these corporations did during that time period. And as you mentioned, that was created before the National Negro Business League, and it goes back to your other question, that yes, there were entrepreneurs there that were trying to be successful business persons. So,
and they did have some really important legacies even after the firm was defunct. You gave the example of Irenemoorman, who became she got her training through the company, but then after they were gone, she herself went into business, I think in Brooklyn, right, as a realtor. And so the legacies outlived the organizations themselves.
Yes. And not only that, she participated in the National Negro Business League meetings. There was a session in which she did the afternoon sessions and he did the evening. So she became a hostess of the National Business League. It was in one of the times that it was in New York. It was in New York, and a general conference was in New York in 1905 and 1910. Yeah. So she's involved practically and theoretically. She's helping any way that she can. Yes.
There's when they were in 1910 in New York, this seems like an interesting moment in Booker T. Washington's history, because his address there, you point out, was a time when he sort of went off of his usual script, and he was he was more assertive than usual in public, at least, in calling out the lack of law and order in the South with lynch law, and criticizing that in New York at that conference, if I remember correctly. And you mentioned Lewis Harlan earlier, and sort of the private Booker T. Washington versus the public Booker T. Washington. Was that speech in New York? It seems important to me. Is that a moment of the private Booker T. Washington coming into the public, or am I reading too much into that?
Personally, I think Booker T. Washington was fed up with some of the racial injustice that was going on, and I think he felt it was appropriate to say something. I mean, when the National Negro Business League was first formed, 1899, when they had their organizing meetings, and in 1900, when they actually had the first conference, he made it a point of saying that he wanted the National Negro Business League to be strictly an economic or business upliftment organization. He didn't want politics, or he didn't want political issues discussed, just economic upliftment. And there were delegates that actually wanted to come and discuss political issues, or they wanted to come and discuss other entrepreneurs that they said were not. They were telling a lie. They were not what they really. Always suppressed that negative talk, because he wanted this organization to be positive. Now, when he deviated away in 1910, that was very, very, very unusual, because I've looked at probably 13 of the speeches that he gave, or 14, I should say, of the speeches that he gave at the National Negro Business League national conventions, and he does not stray away. So that's why I'm saying, personally, I think he felt that something needed to be said. But as you can see, he made that statement, but he always came back to business. So that's 1910. As he's progressing on in life, that's how many. The Atlanta Exposition Address was given in 1895. So that's 15 years after. I think he just grew to the point where he was frustrated. He felt he needed to say something, but it was still kind of polite. It wasn't like a Du Bois, or it wasn't like the way a Malcolm X would say it. It was still said in a polite, rational type of way, and that was his approach. So I wouldn't say behind the scenes thing coming out, as Harlem points out, but I just think he felt it needed to be said, and he said it, I think, in a polite way too.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important because, again, it complicates the sort of cliches that we're taught about Booker T. Washington, and so it's an important addition. And as you suggest, he's getting fed up with this continued, and you say in the book toward the end, and I think it goes well with the story you tell in the article. The structural racism endured, and that often undermined some of the potential business successes. We certainly see that in the New York story, where there are ways where they really did for a while successfully pursue this business vision, but you still slam into this wall of structural racism that the entrepreneurship maybe isn't enough to press through in the moment anyway.
I think even though some of those businesses, failed, some of those individuals in those businesses, they continued on in other ways, in an entrepreneurial type of way. And I think that, that's sort of like the record of businesses, that a lot of them fail, but, people, are persistent. And I think that's the message that Washington wanted to get across, that, if you fail, if the venture fails, take what you can learn from that experience and just keep pushing on and pushing on. And if you look at Up From Slavery, when he's making bricks, for example, you've read Up From Slavery, and he talks about it. It was the fourth time in which the brick mill was formed. 3 times, most people, the other teachers, students, they gave up, but he was persistent. So I think, some of these entrepreneurs, they were successful in other ways, and the message that he wanted to give is for them to be persistent until they develop something, and to be an example for others, to let them know that if you really wanted to advance in American society, that you had to try to make more than a set salary. And he wanted that the people that were really making decisions affecting people in society, policymakers, these were the major entrepreneurs. And he wanted his racial group to grow to be a part of that, to become a force to reckon with. And as I said, a number of times, that this was his strategy. You pull yourself up. The policymakers in communities, he always said, you show me any community, and the influential people shaping policies in those communities, they're often the significant entrepreneurs in those communities. So, yeah.
Well, one of the things that's really, I would say, inspiring about this persistence that you're describing is that it comes from a drive which is really clearly spelled out by Booker T. Washington and in your articulation of his business philosophy that is very nuanced, right? It wasn't it wasn't accommodationist, as you point out, and it wasn't only individualist or purely laissez-faire. It was about business success, and it did, as you point out in the book, follow sort of maybe a little bit of the Protestant work ethic and things like that, but it wasn't just for yourself. It wasn't just to enrich yourself. That persistence was on behalf of then succeeding so that you could uplift an entire community, an entire race. And there's something, again, it's very nuanced on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's something very inspiring about that sort of group project and the persistence in that. And we certainly see it in the New York case. I think that one way we see that is the way that over the decades, we see New York really become the heart of sort of modern African-American culture. And you already mentioned one of the key figures, but what is the role of this story that you tell in setting the stage for the creation of what we think of as modern Harlem?
You know, in the last chapter in the book, I talk about the legacy of Booker T. Washington, and in that chapter, I go nationally. I don't just focus on New York, but the legacy in terms of developing aspects of Harlem is these individuals like Frederick Moore. He continued to espouse that philosophy, and he became head of a newspaper, as I remember, Voices of the Negro. And there were other people as well. I mean, even Marcus Garvey talked about his influence from Booker T. Washington. He saw Washington as a leader, African-American leader. He respected Washington because he felt that these individuals had really developed themselves based on merit, and they didn't get philanthropy from white society. And we know that Garvey's presence had a tremendous impact on the Harlem Renaissance, even though some of those artists might not want to give him credit. But once again, in that legacy chapter, I found a number of entrepreneurs throughout the country and even in New York City that pay homage to Booker T. Washington. Like I said, Philip A. Patton, for example, had a lot of great respect. A lot of them embraced his philosophy that of self-help. Develop something, make yourself an economic niche, and be in demand by everyone, even, and also the African American community. What I found is that philosophy, those ideas persisted in the business community up until about 1955, and some of them even named their business associations after Booker T. Washington. The Booker T. Washington Business Association, for example. So I was surprised to the extent that I found his influence and how it filtered into communities, like I said, all the way up until about 1955. But that thought process is what I'm saying was, filtered in these communities. And not just New York City. I found it throughout New York State. I did an article on the National Negro Business League's influence in New York State, and I found chapters of the National Negro Business League here in Buffalo, where I live. I found them in Rochester. I found them in Ithaca, New York, believe it or not. So it's persistent, but I'm trying to think of some entrepreneurs, specific entrepreneurs in New York. I'm going back to Garvey because Garvey had some businesses in New York City, but he highly respected Booker T. Washington, very much so.
Absolutely. Well, what's interesting about Garvey and especially Booker T. Washington, it seems to me that both of them were always far more popular and influential with the people, the sort of grassroots, than the intellectuals. And I feel like that's kind of shaded the way that especially Booker T. Washington is remembered. I feel like the way the conventional narrative, again, which you have, I think, very you very effectively have disputed the conventional narrative, but I think it almost disregards his influence and popularity with rank and file African Americans who were living through the kind of realities he was trying to fix. Can you give me a sense, not just in business, but in general, for his popularity and what he meant to people around the country, in New York and otherwise, at this time?
I think generally he was respected by lower economic class, middle class, different classes of African Americans. As I alluded to earlier, a number of the intellectuals were against him, but if we look at the class structure, he was influenced by many of those individuals. I mean, if you look at the Tuskegee machine, for example, that Lewis Harlem highlights and Du Bois first highlight, those organizations were members of the higher economic class of the African American community. I would say that after when he gave that Atlanta Exposition address, white elites made him the leader. But as time went on, the masses or his people in general, embraced textbooks on him. They tend to highlight that debate between he and Du Bois. And of course, people in the 21st century and the 20th century, they align themselves with Du Bois based on what's been written. And I think it doesn't really give a true depiction of what Washington was about. I mean, even my students, I mean, most of the times I'm with Du Bois. I'm along those lines, but I try to teach them that these people operated, and then perhaps you have a better appreciation of what they're going through and why they're proposing these specific ideas. Don't use the setting of our times to judge them in their times. But yeah, he was very respected, very much so.
Well, yeah, you make a very important point, and you make it several times in the book. I mean, we're talking about the nadir, and he has to operate within reality, and he has to help uplift African Americans in the best way that he can. And so I think understanding the context is the only way you can even start to have a fair assessment of Washington. And I appreciate so much the way that you do it. And I think it's also interesting, maybe I'm going too far here, but it strikes me that if we just sort of take at face value, white elites like the Atlanta speech and Du Bois doesn't, and that's the whole story, it seems to me that's doing a disservice to rank and file African Americans, sort of the people who aren't powerful, the people who don't have resources, who probably aren't on the record, because it's sort of dismissive of their attraction to Washington. And it does a disservice if we just sort of superficially take the old cliches.
Yeah, and that's where the revisionists come in,
That's right.
Try to paint a different story. Believe it or not, I was in the Tuskegee archives, and they let me. I don't know why they did it. They let me wander in around. Usually they bring materials to you, but they let me wander around in the archives and look at materials, look through boxes, and so on and so forth. And I found that Du Bois sent to Booker T. Washington after he did that Atlanta Exposition address, or gave that Atlanta Exposition address. And as you know, he, in that letter, the original letter, he congratulated Washington. He said, "You did a fine job. You offered an olive branch to these people." So he showed respect, and that, because I read it, and I wasn't surprised, but I was surprised to see the original letter. I gently put it back in place for other people so that they could have access to it. So, yeah, that's where the revisionist folks come in. So, I mean, I think in the 20th century, the 50s on up to close to now, people have gotten that story about Washington. But we do have revisionist people coming out now and say, well, Washington was right, so people are coming out and trying to show a broader picture of him, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate you have a line in here. There are several lines in the book that I really appreciate and will share with students in the future. But one of them is just sort of methodological. You say it is important to examine complex historical figures such as Washington from a number of different perspectives, instead of just writing him off as an accommodationist. And I feel like in the old way, which is still the conventional way of looking at Washington, it's very one-dimensional. And I appreciate how you add so many layers to it. And so it's really, I said it in the beginning, it's really important revisionist work and very nuanced, and I appreciate it so much. And I'm even more appreciative that you've brought some of this work to the pages of the New York History Journal. So I hope everybody will check that out in issue 102.1. Now, I'll say briefly, you've also written about other elements of African-American history in the Empire State that people watching this will probably be interested in. There's one that I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but I'll ask you about it briefly. You wrote about, it's a short book called Dr. Skinner's Remarkable School. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, another interest of mine is the Underground Railroad. And, New York State was a rich area in the Underground Railroad. A lot of us know that Detroit, Michigan, and Niagara Falls, New York, those were entry points, major entry points going into Canada for Underground Railroad. I teach a course on the Underground Railroad, and a student friend of mine did some work on the ethnic community in Niagara Falls. And, he looked at Germans, Italians, Russians, and so on and so forth. But he came across this individual, Platt Henry Skinner. And, his research showed me that Skinner had a school in Niagara Falls, 1858 to about 1862. And that school was sort of like, he first had a school in Washington, D.C., where he educated white and black students that were handicapped, deaf, blind, or mute. And he was a very controversial person. And he was anti-slavery, and he was like Du Bois in the sense that he didn't sugarcoat. He was very blunt, and of course he made enemies. So he was run out of Washington, and he came to Niagara Falls, New York, and he set up a school strictly for what he called colored students. And he had this school in Niagara Falls, as I said, 1858 to 1862. And he started a newspaper called The Mute and the Blind. And in that newspaper, he highlighted his anti-slavery ideas. And I think he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And why? Because in his paper, The Mute and the Blind, he speaks in codes. He talks about fugitive slaves, or writes about fugitive slaves fleeing, and he's asking people, what would you do? Would you help them as God would want you to help them? If the panting deer is running, are you going to turn them into the law, or are you going to help them? He talks in codes like that. And also in a quarterly statement that he produced for people that were giving his school funding to highlight the people that gave monies. But in that statement, he talked about how he went to St. Catharines, Ontario, to bring the children of fugitive slaves to Niagara Falls, New York, to train them in his school. And I've seen census reports which really show where some of those students came from Canada. So I'm thinking he interacted with these fugitive slave communities, and some of their parents were very fearful that their children would be apprehended and taken up into slavery. But I haven't found anything like specifically saying he was, but I really believe that he was. So in that book, I really highlight his activities in Niagara Falls, his anti-slavery ideas, and eventually he got chased out of Niagara Falls, New York, and he went to Trenton, New Jersey. He set up the same school there. He made enemies there, and he died, I think it was 1866. Don't quote me on that date. I have to look it up. But he made enemies there. They burnt his school down, there, and they did it in Washington. So he's one of these very bold people that you either liked him or you didn't like him. But I focus on him because of, I think he was an Underground Railroad conductor.
That's a fascinating story, and now I'm going to have to quickly get my hands on that one and check it out. That's really interesting, and actually, that sounds like it fits nicely with your next big monograph, which is coming out later this year, which is called Blacks in Niagara Falls. Is that right? And it's coming out with SUNY Press.
Yes.
I'd love to have you come back and talk about that in depth once it's out. But for now, give us a taste for the overall story, some of the key themes and turning points in the history of African-American life in Niagara Falls in this new book of yours.
It's one of the hardest projects that I had to ever do because the source base was so minuscule. Almost nothing there, and not just on Blacks, but other ethnic groups within Niagara Falls. Not much information, not much written. And in that book, well, the book basically traces the African-American community of Niagara Falls from 1849, 1850, all the way up to 1985. The early chapter in the book highlights some of the activities on the Underground Railroad, and the book focuses on community development and leadership. I give a general argument that the leadership was progressive in terms of formating community development. So I really look at the leaders that I found, and this argument or this approach is based on the minuscule literature or source base that I found. And when we get from 1940 up to 1985, I was fortunate to be able to interview. I interviewed about 62 formal recorded interviews, and I must have talked to about, informally, beyond these interviews, at least 80 people. I started, I think, 2002. And so I really immersed myself in that community to find out their histories because it wasn't in traditional sources in general. So, one of my favorite parts of the book is the early part where I'm focusing on the early years with the Underground Railroad. And then another favorite part is the 1920s when I start looking at the migration movements that are coming into Niagara Falls. During World War II, I call it the Second Great Migration. Some people have problems with that, but I find that the highest influx of the African Americans come in around World War II and after. And I was able to interview a lot of people, senior citizens that remember those time periods, and they were able to give me some very fruitful information. So I really enjoyed that in terms of talking to senior citizens that talked about their parents migrating from the South and coming up to the North. Perhaps a father would come first, work for a while, set up some kind of base for their families, and then their families would come up and they would establish community. One of the first things they would do after their families were secure to an extent, I found them developing churches. So a lot of the things that are in urban community studies, particularly African American community studies, I found those same things, within the Niagara Falls community. I guess my study is it's a borderland community in the sense that Canada is right there. So there's a lot of interaction between the United States and Canada from the Underground Railroad. And then when we get to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, national activities that are going on between Canada and United States. The Niagara movement, for example, even going back to Washington, the Niagara Falls had a local branch of the National Negro Business League. And then what they did one time is they went over to Canada, Niagara Falls, Ontario, and they interacted with some of the African Canadians. And they had debate between who's the best leader for their racial group, Booker T or Du Bois. And the individuals in Canada, they got into a heated debate. And the people that were part of the Niagara Falls local branch of the Negro Business League, they supported Washington. So that was very interesting. So, but some of my interviews, I tried to convey to the people to give them a sense of what's going on in that community. But once again, for me, that was a difficult study because minuscule source base. I hope I don't have to encounter anything like that again.
Well, it sounds on the one hand like it was an incredibly laborious process, but on the other hand, it sounds like it turns out to have been well worth it because it sounds like a very rich story that you tell. And I now am even more excited to get my hands on this book. I think it comes out a couple months from now, and if you'll do us the honor, I'd love to have you back to talk about it once it's out and once I've had a chance to read it. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us to talk about all of this wonderful scholarship, most especially your new article for New York History, but your broader interventions on Booker T. Washington. I'm so grateful for your time.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having me. It's a nice thing, you do this research and you put it out there, and when people are interested, that's always it makes me happy. I'm sure it makes others happy that produce research as well.
Well, I'm happy to get a chance to talk to you about it, and I'm so grateful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.